On Sunday the 24th of January 1965, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, Harold Wilson, addressed the nation on television. Tonight our nation mourns the loss of the greatest man any of us has ever known. He was speaking of Sir Winston Churchill. He died at 8 o'clock that morning. Churchill's death highlighted a landmark moment in British history. The psychological impact on Great Britain was enormous. As with all endings to some degree, and tragic ones especially, we're left with the strange impression of the end of an era. For Great Britain in 1965, this feeling was almost overwhelming. Much is made of the famous British Reserve, our innate if unhealthy desire to mask our feelings. Certainly we don't announce them to the world. Since this is a national trait, one formed over more than 2 millennia, the reasons for our characteristic reserve are manifold. In modern times, however, this reserve can be traced directly back to the Victorian era. In the 19th century, Britain became great, truly great. In fact, Queen Victoria ruled over the greatest empire the world has ever known. We British were proud of ourselves and of our extraordinary achievements. Literally, Britannia ruled the waves. All of them. Things were not looking so rosy by the end of the Victorian era though, with wars in southern Africa revealing both an embarrassing weakness in British military might and an extraordinary evil in British bureaucracy. By the end of the First World War, the empire was crumbling. By the end of the Second World War, really, there was no such thing as a British Empire. In 1956, the humiliating debacle of the Suez Crisis proved, if proof were needed, that while Britain might still be great, we were certainly not a superpower anymore. In the meantime, we British began to understand the incredible malevolence that had been employed to establish and then to sustain our empire. The middle of the 17th century saw the evils of official slavery begin, and, incredibly, it all went downhill from there. We British exercised grotesque violence on huge swathes of the world's populations, up to and including genocide. Our empire was truly great, but so was our evil. At home, millions of Britons were forced into virtual serfdom, where employment was cruel, miserably rewarded, and even deadly. Today, we celebrate some of the greatest Britons who have ever lived, like Isambard Kingdom Brunel. His many incredible engineering achievements during the Industrial Revolution have become legendary. He built bridges, dockyards, railways, ships, and tunnels, many still used today with modern trains and ships and road traffic. Yet even here there is evil. The building of Brunel's famous box tunnel for the Great Western Railway in Wiltshire cost over 100 workmen their lives. Nowadays we recognise the vile social injustice and deprivation that came with the Industrial Revolution, and that the dreadful cost of progress was borne entirely by the poor. And alas, so was the British Empire itself. Huge, magnificent, innovative and modern, but ultimately built on evil. This means that today we British are a proud race. We're proud to have been around for so long, and we're proud of our achievements and of our greatest citizens. But we're deeply ashamed that nearly all of this was achieved with terrible injustice and violence. Embarrassed, actually. So we sing with the revellers at the promenade concerts, "Rule Britannia," and we're happy and proud to do so. But we remember too that when Britannia did rule the waves, it was an evil dictatorship. Thus, nationalism to us is a dangerous word. We use it, and are proud to be nationalistically British, but we don't like to shout about it too much, only at football matches or concerts and in general pomp and ceremony like state funerals. But we're reserved outside these times because we don't want our nationalism to be confused with our past shame, jingoism, brutality, racism and genocide. That's why the average Brit in the 21st century can accurately be described as being reserved in nature. And that's why, too, that Winston Churchill's death marked the end of an era, even though that era had actually ended years before. Churchill was the last of the great Britons. He was essentially a Victorian remnant. He was proud of empire, he fought for it as a soldier, and even led us through the darkest hour, when empire was already a thing of the past. By his very presence, it reminded us of what we once were, of what potential we have, and of what Great Britain really was. Sir Winston Churchill was an actual building block of classical Great Britain, a genuine British bulldog, perhaps the very last. And with his death, a new reality hit home with all and sundry. There was simply no one to replace him. There never has been. Which political leader has shown themselves to be a fraction of what Churchill was? All we in Britain have to look back on politically is 2 generations of dreadful leadership. It seems that Henry Kissinger was right. 90% of politicians really do give the other 10% a bad reputation. British national melancholy in the mid-1960s only served to further distort our view of America, where so much seemed to be available and anything was possible. The American dream seemed to offer a genuine utopia to one and all. In the last episode, we noted that the still strictly American Sportster XL had barely changed in the early 1960s. Perhaps this reflected a significant slump for Harley-Davidson, which saw the motor company's annual bike sales fall from nearly 30,000 after the war to under 10,000 in 1963. But by now, the 60s were in full swing. Harley-Davidson's bike sales had ballooned to over 25,000 in 1965, and registered motorcycle ownership in the US, which was 200,000 in 1945, had exploded to 2.8 million by 1970. If the slump in sales had pressed Harley-Davidson to pause any significant development for the Sportster XL, one apparently insignificant change for 1965 saw the Sportster XLH, the touring version, gain an exciting 12-volt electrical system to replace the 6-volt example. And, in classic Harley fashion, this new system was, in reality, the same old voltage regulator with a new 12-volt generator, all powered by 2 6-volt batteries. Although the change may have seemed pointless at the time, especially since the XL C8s retained the old 6-volt system, it actually heralded what, to me, was an essential change, but that wasn't to come for 2 more years. By 1966, Harley-Davidson was moving predictably slowly towards the modern age. The large V-twins were now starting to be equipped with what, to many, is the ubiquitous Harley engine, the shovelhead. And, perhaps to reflect the rise in sales, the motor company turned their attention to the Sportster. The venerable XL engine, so full of Western promise, was about to beat the world. We've seen how Harley-Davidson had spent a decade debunking the no replacement for displacement nonsense by keeping the Sportster XL engine at 8883C or 54 cubic inches. One of the many direct replacements for displacement is, therefore, better plumbing. While the XL engine had received many plumbing upgrades since 1957, a new one was introduced in 1966. This was a new camshaft design. These new cams became almost legendary and are known as P-cams. In the last video, we saw that the characteristic shape of the Sportster XL engine had been preserved for 65 years because the engine architecture remained the same. Specifically on the right-hand side, the 4 cams with their gears and the idler above. This configuration is uncommon these days as its old-fashioned and comparatively cumbersome design. Most modern engines place the cams above the cylinders, which is more efficient and allows the engine to operate at greater speeds or at higher revolutions per minute, RPM. We'll look more closely at the difference between overhead cams and the famous old pushrod design which Harley-Davidson have traditionally followed in a later video. This Wikimedia animation shows an overhead cam engine. With the cams on top of the cylinders and valves, we can see more clearly how cams work. The cam lobes are egg-shaped, so when the pointy part of the cam spins onto the valve is pushed open. The left-hand exhaust valve opens to expel the exhaust gases and then closes. The right-hand inlet valve opens to allow the fuel-air mixture in before closing again. With both valves closed, compression can occur. This is all plumbing. The quicker and more smoothly the gases can be drawn into and out of the cylinder, the more efficient and powerful the engine will be, and the cams are a massively important part of the plumbing process. Specifically, it's the cam lobes which are critical. If the egg-shaped cam is rounder or fatter, then the valves will open earlier and for a longer time. If the shape is thinner, the valves open later and for less time. If the pointy part of the cam lobe is raised up, the valve will open correspondingly wider and vice versa. But if the cam lobe is too pointy, the valve will open too far and hit the rising piston. This will cause catastrophic engine failure. If the lobe is too broad at the top, the valve will stay open too long and compression will be lost. If the tip of the lobe is too narrow, the valve won't open long enough to allow all the gases to pass through. This means that the cam design is as wildly complicated as it is important. There's a virtually infinite variation of cam designs for any given engine, and one is not necessarily better than the other. Each cam is fashioned to achieve a specific goal. Some cams allow higher engine speeds, which allows greater power. Other cams are designed for lower engine speeds, but with much more of the engine power at very low RPM. A racing engine, for instance, will likely be a screamer because it's designed to have the highest possible power, and that will be achieved at the highest RPM. The 1990 Honda CBR 250 RR was a road-legal sports bike that could rev to a staggering 20,000 RPM. A bus, like this gorgeous 1949 Bedford OB, has a 3.5 litre 6-cylinder engine that produces 73 horsepower at only 3,000 RPM. It offered maximum power at a very low engine speed. Horses for courses. Modern engines are often very flexible, so they can be tuned for very specific purposes. The Harley-Davidson Sportster engine is one such engine, but more so. When the Sportster H model was released in 1959, Harley advertised it as having 12% more power. 7 years later, in 1966, that same engine, offered with the new P cams, was advertised as having a further 15% more power. Since motor manufacturers' claims are notoriously unreliable, or downright lies, what did these figures mean in the real world? Remember that the original 1957 Sportster XL offered a meagre 40 horsepower. In April 1965, though, the US magazine Cycle World published their test of the Sportster XLH, noting the power figure of 55 brake horsepower. In large part, they wrote, this power is due to the engine's large valves. 55 brake horsepower completely overshadows the 1966 Triumph Bonneville's offering of just 46 horsepower, albeit for a much lighter bike. And just for the record, the difference between horsepower and brake horsepower is too small for us to worry about. In September 1965, I was not quite 2 years old, yet I still managed to waddle my way to the local newsagent and purchase for myself the latest issue of Motorcycle Mechanics. This is my personal copy, cherished for 58 years. It cost 2 shillings of my pocket money, but, as the child prodigy I clearly must have been, I was thrilled to be able to read the article entitled Harley Handful. The article begins, "The Sportster XLCH has the highest top speed of any of the standard production bikes we've tested. 122 miles an hour. Previously, the BSA Gold Star at 110 miles an hour was the fastest motorcycle in production, but until the Triumph BSA Rocket achieved 125 in 1968, the Harley-Davidson Sportster was the world's fastest production motorcycle. It seems incredible today to consider a Harley-Davidson anything as fast, but right in the middle of the swinging 60s, the Sportster XL CH was the fastest new motorcycle you could buy anywhere in the world. This was the greatness of the Sportster fully achieved. And while all the under-the-bonnet stuff was going on to create the world's fastest production bike, one feature materialised in 1966 which proved to be an essential part of the Sportster's iconic look, remaining in place for the next 56 years: the humble air filter box. Of course, in Harley speak, the air filter is referred to as the air cleaner, and this instantly recognisable oval shape is identified as the ham can air cleaner. For younger viewers who have no idea what I'm talking about, here is a can of ham. It's not to be confused, of course, with the Can of Ham building in London. The ham can air cleaner was introduced because tougher emissions regulations required a larger filter. Also included for 1966 was the new and much improved Tillotson carburettor, replacing the old Linkert model. Many identify the XLCH of this year to be the greatest of all the Sportsters, and with good reason. All the ingredients are here now. The performance is literally world-beating, and the styling has become absolutely iconic. What could be better? What about the XLH touring version? For me, the XLH is preferred to the XLCH because it's way more practical and much better equipped. However, it doesn't quite ascend the Sportster throne yet. But in 1967 for me, it does, because now the XLH is equipped with a pucker electric start for the first time, and to replace the two 6-volt batteries, a proper 12-volt battery to boot. On its own, a 12-volt electrical system wasn't really required, but if a motorcycle is going to use an electric start, a 12-volt system is essential. Until 1966, all Sportster XLs were kickstart only. The electric start required a slight revision to the engine cases, which meant that Harley were producing two configurations of engine between 1967 and 1969, one for the electric start XLH Tourer and one for the XLCH Sport model with kickstart only. The XLH frames also tweaked to fit the new starter and battery box. All of which might sound like a lot of trouble to go to, just to incorporate an electric starter. Why bother, when the Sportster's been going strong for so long without it? Well, the old Ironhead Sportster was notoriously difficult to start. The Harley Handful article in Motorcycle Mechanics notes that the long-stroke engine, the high compression, the heavy engine parts and the magneto ignition all contribute to make kick-starting a Sportster, quote, definitely a man-sized job. Coupled with the viscous engine oils of the day, it meant that kicking a Sportster into life required all the rider's body weight and a very strongly determined right leg. Unfortunately, the extreme difficulty experienced in trying to spin the engine into life meant that often it would just not fire. Sometimes, if a piston neared the top of the stroke without firing, the compression would force the piston backwards, releasing the full force of the compression back through the kickstart and into the rider's leg. Similarly, early Sportsters had a very weak ratchet spring on their kickstart, which might break or simply refuse to engage the ratchet. This meant that the rider, putting all his or her enthusiasm into kicking the beast into action, forced down the kickstart only to find no resistance at all, which, according to Donnie Peterson, could be just as painful. Thus, an electric start is a no-brainer. For me, it's the 1967 Sportster XLH which is the king of the Sportsters. You get the same awesome engine, but with all the practical necessities needed like electric starting, dual seat, larger petrol tank and indicators. In 1968, the XLCH also received the 12-volt electrical system, and for 1969, electric start was made available. But I suspect for most Sportster fans, it's the incredible 1966 Sportster XL which is regarded as the king of the Sportsters. And who can really argue? It was in 1966 that Harley-Davidson finally put all the ingredients together and hit the jackpot. All the iconic pieces were now in the right place at the right time. The petrol tank was the unmistakable peanut style, which to me is ugly, but love it or hate it, this peculiarly shaped and dreadfully undersized tank is a Sportster petrol tank. Beneath it, the large oval-shaped airbox became as iconic as its nickname, the ham can. Beneath that, the equally iconic Shorty Jules twin exhaust cradle the unmistakable engine cases with the snail's head holding the generator in the Ironhead Sportsters. Then there's the engine, the glorious engine, with the cylinders set in the classic Harley-Davidson 45-degree V-twin configuration and the plumbing honed to near perfection by 1966. The Sportster XL was the fastest production motorcycle available anywhere on the planet, and for 3 whole years the Harley-Davidson Sportster really was the greatest motorcycle in the world.